Hot night in an empty neighborhood, the yellowish streetlights illuminate the rusty gate of an old police station. A former policeman parks his old car, walking with heavy steps towards the kennel, hidden in the back. Behind the bars, a huge canine growls low, marked by scars and a fixed gaze. The girl appears alone, holding a piece of bread with her two small hands. The animal stops growling, tilts its head, while the wind stirs the dry leaves around. On the other side, the ex-policeman slowly walks away, not knowing whether to return or give up. In the heavy silence, a distant explosion tears through the early dawn and causes the canine to suddenly rise. And for a second, no one knows what will happen. Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. The rusted gate creaked in the autumn wind that swept through Millfield, Indiana, a sound that had become as familiar to the residents as the morning church bells. Behind those iron bars, in a makeshift kennel attached to the abandoned police station on Elm Street, lived what was once the pride of the Millfield Police Department. Ranger, a massive German shepherd with scars that told stories no one wanted to remember, paced the small concrete enclosure that had become his world. 10-year-old Emma Thompson pressed her small face against the cool metal of the fence, her breath creating little clouds in the crisp October air. Her blonde pigtails bounced as she shifted her weight from one sneaker to the other, clutching a paper bag that contained the remnants of her lunch sandwich. The other kids at Millfield Elementary had long since learned to avoid this part of town, but Emma felt drawn here by something she couldn't quite explain. "Easy, boy," she whispered through the bars, though Ranger remained at the far end of his enclosure, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have frightened most adults. The dog's massive frame spoke of strength and training, but there was something else in his posture, something that looked almost like loneliness. Sarah Thompson's voice carried across the empty lot as she called for her daughter. Emma, where are you?" The concern in her mother's voice was evident, tinged with the kind of worry that had become constant since they'd moved to Millfield 6 months ago. Sarah worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet after the divorce, and keeping track of Emma's whereabouts had become increasingly challenging. Emma quickly stepped back from the fence, but not before tossing a piece of her peanut butter sandwich through the bars. It landed a few feet from Ranger, who watched it with calculated indifference. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised quietly, then turned and ran toward her mother's voice. The Thompson family had come to Millfield seeking a fresh start, a place where Sarah could rebuild their lives away from the complications of her failed marriage. The small town of 8,000 people had seemed perfect, quiet, safe, and affordable. But like many small towns, Millfield harbored secrets beneath its peaceful facade. And the abandoned police station with its solitary occupant was just one of them. Ranger had been the department's finest K-9 officer, trained in tracking, drug detection, and tactical operations. For 7 years, he'd served alongside Officer Michael Chen, forming a partnership that had become legendary in local law enforcement circles. Together, they'd solved cases that had stumped detectives for months and had participated in operations that extended far beyond Millfield's modest borders. But that was before the incident that no one talked about anymore. Before Ranger was quietly retired and forgotten, before the whispers began to paint him as dangerous and unpredictable. The official reports were sealed, the details buried in bureaucratic red tape, but the townspeople had drawn their own conclusions. A hero had become a pariah, and now he lived in isolation while the town debated his fate. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, who lived in the house closest to the abandoned station, made her daily pilgrimage to her mailbox with theatrical caution, glancing nervously at the kennel as if expecting an attack at any moment. At 73, she'd appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial watchdog, and Ranger's presence had become her primary source of both anxiety and social currency. "That beast needs to be put down before someone gets hurt," she announced to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in Millfield her entire life. I don't care what he used to be. Look at him now, wild, unpredictable, dangerous. Her complaints had found fertile ground among other residents, particularly those with young children or small pets. The daily sounds that emanated from the kennel, deep, guttural growls, and the occasional bark had fueled their fears and given birth to increasingly dramatic stories about Ranger's supposedly violent nature. But Emma saw something different. During her daily visits, which had started as curious detours on her way home from school, she'd noticed patterns in Ranger's behavior that others had missed. The growling intensified when multiple people approached the fence, but when she came alone, he seemed almost calm. His movements were deliberate, controlled, not the frantic pacing of a mad animal, but the measured steps of a professional maintaining readiness. The piece of sandwich remained untouched as Emma reluctantly joined her mother. Sarah Thompson's face showed the familiar mixture of relief and exasperation that had become her default expression when finding her daughter. At 34, Sarah still maintained the delicate beauty that had caught her ex-husband's attention years ago. But the stress of single motherhood and financial uncertainty had added lines around her green eyes. "Emma, honey, you can't keep wandering off like this," Sarah said, taking her daughter's hand as they walked toward their modest rental house 3 blocks away. "Especially not to that place. That dog is dangerous." "He's not dangerous, Mom," Emma replied with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "He's just lonely." Sarah's expression softened slightly, recognizing her daughter's compassionate nature, but the concern remained. As a newcomer to Millfield, she'd heard the stories, the warnings, the constant speculation about what should be done with the abandoned K9. The consensus seemed clear: Ranger represented a threat that the community could no longer tolerate. What Sarah didn't know was that other forces were already in motion, forces that would soon transform their quiet new life into something far more complicated. Detective Rick Vaughn, recently retired from the state police and now working as a private security consultant, had been making discreet inquiries about Ranger for weeks. His interest, however, had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with profit. Vaughn knew the underground market for trained attack dogs, particularly former police K9s. The same training that made Ranger valuable to law enforcement made him worth a considerable sum to certain private individuals who operated outside the law. But first, he needed to establish the right narrative, create the perfect justification for removing the dog from Millfield. As Emma and Sarah walked home through the tree-lined streets of their new neighborhood, neither of them could have imagined that their lives were about to become entangled with forces much larger than a lonely girl's kindness to a forgotten police dog. The quiet desperation of Millfield's residents, their fear of the unknown, and their willingness to believe the worst about a once-honored protector had created the perfect storm. Behind them, in his concrete prison, Ranger watched their retreating figures through the rusty bars. The sandwich lay untouched in the dirt, but something had changed in the dog's demeanor. For the first time in months, his tail had moved almost imperceptibly, not quite a wag, but a sign that somewhere beneath the carefully constructed walls of professional detachment, recognition was beginning to dawn. The following Tuesday brought the kind of crisp morning that made Millfield's autumn colors seem to glow against the gray sky. Emma Thompson clutched her school bag tighter as she approached the familiar rusted gate, her breath visible in small puffs of vapor. This time, she'd come prepared with more than just sandwich scraps. Hidden in her jacket pocket were 3 strips of beef jerky she'd carefully saved from her weekend camping trip with the local Girl Scout troop. Ranger stood at attention in the center of his enclosure, and for the first time, Emma noticed that the previous day's offering had disappeared. A small thrill of victory shot through her chest as she realized the proud animal had finally accepted her gift, even if he'd waited until she was gone to claim it. "Good morning, Ranger," she said softly, using the name she'd overheard Mrs. Henley mention to her mail carrier. "I brought you something better today." The massive German Shepherd's ears pricked forward slightly, a subtle movement that would have been missed by most observers. But Emma was learning to read the nuances of his behavior, the small signs that indicated his attention. She slowly reached into her pocket and withdrew one strip of jerky, holding it up so he could see it clearly. "It's okay," she whispered, extending her hand toward the fence. "I'm not gonna hurt you." What happened next would have terrified any adult watching, but Emma felt only wonder as Ranger slowly, deliberately approached the fence. His massive paws made no sound on the concrete as he moved with the fluid precision of his training. When he reached the barrier between them, he sat, his dark eyes never leaving Emma's face. The gesture was so controlled, so professional, that it spoke of years of disciplined service. This was not the behavior of a wild, dangerous animal. This was a trained officer waiting for commands that would never come. Emma carefully pushed the jerky through one of the gaps in the fence, close enough that Ranger could reach it without her fingers being in danger. He took it with surprising gentleness, his teeth barely grazing her fingertips as he accepted the offering. For a moment, their eyes met through the bars, and Emma felt a connection that transcended species and circumstance. "You were a good dog once, weren't you?" she said, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "You're still a good dog. People just forgot." 3 blocks away, Detective Rick Vaughn sat in his unmarked sedan, watching the interaction through a pair of binoculars. At 48, Vaughn carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd spent most of his career bending rules and walking the line between law and lawlessness. His retirement from the state police hadn't been entirely voluntary, though the official records would never reflect the internal investigations that had hastened his departure. The sight of the young girl interacting peacefully with Ranger complicated his plans, but Vaughn was nothing if not adaptable. He'd built his reputation on finding ways to turn obstacles into opportunities, and this situation would be no different. If anything, the child's naive trust might serve his purposes better than he'd originally imagined. Vaughn's cell phone buzzed with an incoming text. Message from a contact listed simply as JR. The message was brief. Dog still available? Client getting impatient. Price going up. A cold smile crossed Vaughn's weathered features as he typed his response. Soon, building narrative. Premium product requires proper setup. The client in question operated a private security firm that specialized in providing protection services to individuals whose activities attracted the attention of law enforcement. Former police K9s were particularly valuable in such circles. Their training in detection and protection made them ideal for both defensive and offensive operations. The fact that Ranger's official records indicated expertise in tactical situations only increased his market value. But first, Vaughn needed to ensure that when Ranger disappeared, no one would question the circumstances. The community's existing fear provided the foundation, but he needed an incident, something that would justify immediate action and make his intervention appear heroic rather than opportunistic. As Emma continued her gentle interaction with Ranger, neither she nor the watching detective noticed the subtle signs of disturbance around the abandoned police station. Fresh scratches marked the wooden fence posts, scratches too deep and too high to have been made by Ranger. In the soft earth behind the building, partially obscured by fallen leaves, were tracks that spoke of a presence far different from the controlled German Shepherd in the kennel. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Millfield's only veterinarian, discovered the first concrete evidence of this other presence when she arrived at her clinic that morning. The small animal hospital on Maple Street served the entire county, and Dr. Walsh was accustomed to seeing injuries that ranged from routine to bizarre. But the wounds on the cat that farmer Bob Peterson brought in just after sunrise were unlike anything in her 15 years of practice. "Found her like this in my barn," Peterson explained, his weathered hands gentle as he held the injured tabby. "Something got after her, but she managed to get away. Never seen marks like these. Dr. Walsh examined the scratches with growing concern. They were clean, precise and deep cuts that spoke of claws longer and sharper than any domestic animal possessed. The pattern suggested a predator with significantly larger paws than any cat or dog. But the spacing was wrong for the bears that occasionally wandered down from the northern forests. "Bob, I'm going to need to report this to animal control," she said, photographing the wounds with her digital camera. "These injuries suggest we might have a problem animal in the area." Peterson nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Been hearing things at night, sounds I can't place. My livestock's been spooked for weeks." What neither Dr. Walsh nor Peterson realized was that similar incidents had been occurring throughout the rural areas surrounding Millfield for nearly a month. Isolated farmers and ranchers had reported disturbed animals, destroyed property, and strange tracks. But in the tradition of rural communities, most had kept their concerns to themselves, hoping the problem would resolve naturally. Meanwhile, Emma's daily visits to Ranger had begun to follow a pattern that brought structure to both their lives. Each afternoon after school, she would arrive with a small offering and spend 15 minutes talking to the attentive dog. She told him about her classes, her worries about making friends in a new town, and her mother's long hours at the diner. Ranger listened with the patience of a trained professional, and gradually his responses became more animated. His tail, which had remained motionless for months, began to move slightly when he saw her approaching. His ears would perk up at the sound of her voice, and occasionally, Emma could swear she heard something that almost sounded like a whimper of recognition. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by the neighbors. Mrs. Henley watched from her kitchen window with growing alarm as the supposedly dangerous animal displayed what appeared to be affection for the child. Rather than reassuring her about Ranger's true nature, the development only deepened her conviction that immediate action was necessary. "That dog is manipulating that poor child," she announced to her afternoon bridge club. "Everyone knows how cunning these attack dogs can be. Today it's gentle with her. Tomorrow it could snap and hurt someone." Her words found ready agreement among the other women, who had spent months feeding each other's fears about the abandoned K9. The consensus was clear: something needed to be done before tragedy struck their peaceful community. What none of them considered was that their peaceful community was already facing a threat, one that had nothing to do with the lonely German shepherd in the rusted kennel. As Emma finished her daily visit and walked home through the gathering dusk, she felt watched by eyes that belonged to neither human nor domestic animal. The sensation was fleeting but unmistakable, a primitive awareness that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Behind her, Ranger stood at the fence, watching her departure with visible anxiety. His professional training had awakened other senses, and the scent carried on the evening wind spoke of danger approaching Millfield from directions that no one was watching. The emergency town meeting at Millfield Community Center drew the largest crowd anyone could remember for a Thursday evening. Sarah Thompson sat in the back row, Emma fidgeting beside her as Mayor Patricia Reynolds called for order among the increasingly agitated residents. The past week had brought 3 more incidents of property damage and injured animals, and the community's patience had reached its breaking point. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," Mayor Reynolds called out over the rising voices, "we're here to address legitimate concerns about public safety. Let's keep this civil." Dorothy Henley rose from her front row seat, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the evening's chaos. "Civil?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd attended every town meeting for 40 years. "How can we be civil when there's a killer beast living 3 blocks from the elementary school?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Sarah noticed that not everyone seemed convinced. Dr. Jennifer Walsh sat near the middle of the room, her expression troubled as she clutched a manila folder containing photographs that told a story the community wasn't ready to hear. "Mrs. Henley," Dr. Walsh stood, her professional demeanor commanding attention. "I've examined the animals that were injured in these incidents. The wounds are consistent with a large predator, but not a domestic dog. The claw marks are too long, too widely spaced. Are you saying it's not the police dog? Asked Tom Martinez, who owned the hardware store on Main Street. His question carried hope that maybe their fears had been misplaced. Before Dr. Walsh could respond, a new voice cut through the discussion. I think I can shed some light on this situation. Detective Rick Vaughn stepped forward from the side wall where he'd been observing, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. His years in law enforcement had taught him exactly how to project authority when needed. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rick Vaughn, recently retired from the state police. I've spent considerable time studying the situation with the K9 unit housed at the old station. He paused, letting his credentials sink in before continuing. What we're dealing with is a highly trained attack dog that's been isolated and neglected for months. The stress of confinement can cause even the most disciplined animals to become unpredictable. Sarah felt Emma tense beside her as Vaughn continued his presentation. The child had never mentioned knowing the detective's name, but something in her posture suggested recognition, or at least wariness. The injuries we're seeing are absolutely consistent with a large German Shepherd, Vaughn continued, deliberately contradicting Dr. Walsh's assessment. These dogs are trained to inflict maximum damage when they attack. The fact that the animal hasn't killed anyone yet is more luck than anything else. Dr. Walsh started to object, but Vaughn smoothly moved on. I've worked with K9 units for over 20 years. I know how these animals think, how they operate. This particular dog, Ranger, was retired under circumstances that raised serious questions about his stability. The room fell silent as Vaughn's words sank in. He'd carefully avoided stating any outright lies while implying connections that didn't exist. The art of manipulation, he'd learned long ago, lay in letting people draw their own conclusions from carefully presented facts. What are you suggesting we do? Mayor Reynolds asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I'm offering to handle the situation, Vaughn replied. I have the expertise and resources to safely remove the animal from our community. The dog can be relocated to a facility better equipped to handle dangerous former police animals. What Vaughn didn't mention was that the facility he had in mind was a private training compound in Nevada where former military and police animals were prepared for sale to private security contractors. Ranger's value on the underground market would more than compensate for the effort required to orchestrate his removal. Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve, her voice an urgent whisper. Mom, he's lying. Ranger isn't dangerous. I see him every day, and he's gentle. Sarah's protective instincts flared at her daughter's words. Emma's been visiting that dog? She asked, her voice rising above the intended whisper. The admission rippled through the nearby rows, and suddenly all eyes were on the Thompson family. Emma shrank under the scrutiny, but her chin remained raised in defiance of the adult judgment surrounding her. Your daughter has been approaching the animal? Vaughn asked, his voice filled with calculated concern. Mrs. Thompson, that's extremely dangerous behavior. The fact that the dog hasn't attacked her yet only demonstrates how unpredictable these situations can become. He's not unpredictable, Emma said, her voice small but determined. He's sad and lonely, but he's not mean. The room erupted in concerned murmurs as parents instinctively moved to shield their own children from what they perceived as a dangerous influence. Sarah felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her, the familiar sensation of being an outsider in a community that had predetermined its conclusions. But not everyone in the room agreed with the prevailing sentiment. James Foster, a retired Marine who lived near the Thompson family, stood up slowly. His weathered face bore the scars of combat, and his quiet authority commanded respect even among those who disagreed with him. With all due respect, Detective Vaughn, Foster said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. I've seen the dog interacting with the girl. If Ranger was truly unstable, a child wouldn't be able to approach him safely. Military and police animals are trained to assess threats, not attack indiscriminately. Vaughn's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. The presence of someone with actual experience handling trained animals threatened to undermine his carefully constructed narrative. Mr. Foster, I appreciate your military service, but police canines are different from military working dogs. This animal has been traumatized by isolation and abandonment. Have you personally observed the dog's behavior? Foster asked pointedly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Vaughn had indeed observed Ranger, but only through binoculars, and only in the context of planning his removal. He'd never actually approached the kennel or attempted to assess the animal's true temperament. I've conducted my evaluation based on professional standards and case history, Vaughn replied, deflecting the direct question. The risk to this community is real and immediate. Dr. Walsh stood again, her folder of evidence clutched tightly. I need everyone to look at these photographs, she said, moving toward the front of the room. The injuries I've documented are not consistent with dog attacks. The claw patterns, the depth of the wounds, the spacing of the marks all point to a different type of predator. She began distributing copies of her photographs, and the room's energy shifted as people examined the evidence. The wounds were indeed unlike anything most of the residents had seen, and several hunting enthusiasts in the crowd began to murmur recognition of patterns they'd encountered in the wild. These look like bear marks, said Bill Richardson, who guided hunting expeditions in the northern counties. But the size is wrong. Too big for black bears, wrong pattern for brown bears. Could be a big cat, suggested another voice. Mountain lion, maybe. They've been extending their range eastward. Vaughn watched his carefully orchestrated presentation begin to unravel as the community started considering alternative explanations. The presence of an actual threat would complicate his plans, but it also provided new opportunities. If he could find a way to link Ranger to the real predator, he might still achieve his goals. Ladies and gentlemen, he interjected, regardless of what's causing these attacks, we still have a dangerous, isolated animal living in our community. Even if Ranger isn't directly responsible for the recent incidents, his presence creates an additional risk we can't afford. The logic was flawed, but it resonated with people who were already frightened and looking for simple solutions to complex problems. The meeting continued for another hour, with various factions arguing for different approaches. But Vaughn had successfully planted the seeds of doubt about Ranger's presence. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah gathered her courage and approached Dr. Walsh. Doctor, what do you really think is happening here? Dr. Walsh glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard before responding. Sarah, I think we have a genuine predator in the area, something that's been displaced from its natural habitat. But I also think that Dog is being made a scapegoat for problems he didn't create. What should I do about Emma? Sarah asked. She's so attached to him. Has she ever shown any fear around the animal? Dr. Walsh asked. Sarah shook her head. Just the opposite. She seems more confident, more purposeful since she started visiting him. Then maybe, Dr. Walsh said quietly, you should trust your daughter's instincts. Children often see things more clearly than adults do. As the Thompson family walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the trees behind the community center. The real predator that had been terrorizing the area moved with a silence that spoke of perfect adaptation to hunting in human environments, and its attention had been drawn by the scents and sounds of the evening's gathering. The hunt was expanding, and the choices made in the coming days would determine whether Millfield's residents would face their real threat or continue chasing the ghosts of their own fears. The weekend brought an unseasonable warmth to Millfield, the kind of Indian summer day that made the approaching winter seem like a distant threat. Emma Thompson sat cross-legged in front of Ranger's kennel, a worn paperback copy of Where the Red Fern Grows open in her lap. She discovered that reading aloud seemed to calm the massive German shepherd. And today, he lay stretched out near the fence, his dark eyes fixed on her face as she navigated the adventures of Billy and his hunting dogs. "See, Ranger," she said, looking up from the book. "Dogs and people can be real partners. Billy's dogs would do anything to protect him, and he'd do anything to protect them." Ranger's tail thumped once against the concrete, a response that would have amazed anyone who'd witnessed his supposedly aggressive behavior. In the 3 weeks since Emma had begun her regular visits, the transformation in the animal had been remarkable, though few people had been close enough to observe it. What Emma didn't notice was the figure watching from the abandoned police station's second-floor window. Detective Rick Vaughn had been conducting surveillance for days, documenting every interaction between the girl and the dog. His cell phone contained dozens of photographs and video clips that would serve multiple purposes. In the plan he'd been refining since the town meeting, Vaughn's phone buzzed with an incoming call from his contact in Nevada. "Status report," came the gruff voice without preamble. "Timeline's accelerating," Vaughn replied quietly. "Community pressure is building. I should have the package ready for transport within the week." "Good. Clients offering a bonus for quick delivery." This particular animal's reputation has reached some interested parties in the private sector. Vaughn smiled coldly. Ranger's law enforcement background made him valuable, but the rumors about his retirement circumstances had elevated that value significantly. Certain clients paid premium prices for animals with questionable histories, believing that dogs who'd crossed lines in official service would be more willing to cross them in private employment. "What about containment during transport?" the voice asked. "That won't be an issue," Vaughn assured him. "The animal will be properly sedated for the journey. Professional handling throughout." As he ended the call, Vaughn's attention returned to the scene below. Emma had finished her reading and was now engaged in what appeared to be a training exercise with Ranger. She held her hand up in a stay gesture, and the dog remained motionless as she walked backward several steps. When she called, "Come," he approached the fence with measured steps and sat precisely where she indicated. The display of obedience was problematic for Vaughn's narrative. A truly dangerous, unstable animal wouldn't respond to commands from an untrained child. But rather than abandoning his plans, Vaughn saw an opportunity to accelerate them. If the community believed the dog was becoming attached to the girl, they might be more willing to support immediate action to prevent a potential tragedy. Meanwhile, 3 miles outside Millfield's town limits, Farmer Dale Morrison was making a discovery that would change everything. Morrison had been checking his cattle in the back pasture when he found the remains of one of his prize bulls. The massive animal had been brought down by something with strength and hunting skills that defied explanation. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, examining the scene with growing alarm. The bull weighed nearly 2,000 pounds, yet something had managed to take it down and partially consume it before abandoning the carcass. The tracks around the site told a story that made Morrison question everything he thought he knew about local wildlife. The paw prints were massive, larger than any bear he'd encountered in 40 years of farming. But the gait pattern was wrong for a bear, suggesting something that moved with feline grace but possessed size and strength beyond any mountain lion. Whatever had made these tracks was an apex predator operating far outside its natural range. Morrison immediately called Sheriff David Carter, who arrived within 30 minutes, accompanied by State Wildlife Officer Rebecca Hayes. Hayes had been tracking unusual predator activity across 3 counties for the past month, following a trail of increasingly bold attacks that suggested a large carnivore had established territory in an area where none should exist. "Dale, I need you to keep this quiet for now," Sheriff Carter said after examining the scene. "If word gets out about something this size operating in the area, we'll have panic." "What about my other cattle?" Morrison demanded. "Am I supposed to just wait for this thing to pick them off, one by one?" Officer Hayes was photographing the tracks and claw marks with professional thoroughness. "Mr. Morrison, based on these signs, I believe we're dealing with a large cat, possibly an escaped exotic animal or a wild specimen that's been displaced from its natural habitat. These attacks show intelligence and adaptation to local conditions. How long has it been in the area? Sheriff Carter asked. Based on the reports I've been collecting, at least 6 weeks, Hayes replied. It's been working the periphery of human settlement, taking livestock and pets, but avoiding direct contact with people. That pattern suggests it's learning our routines, our weaknesses. The implication hung heavy in the autumn air. Whatever was hunting in the forests around Millfield was not just surviving, but thriving, growing bolder with each successful encounter. And predators that lost their fear of humans eventually saw them as prey. Back in town, Emma's afternoon visit was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henley and 2 other neighborhood women. The trio approached the kennel with the determined stride of people who'd convinced themselves they were performing a civic duty. "Young lady, you need to step away from that animal immediately," Mrs. Henley commanded, her voice carrying the authority of assumed moral superiority. "Your behavior is encouraging a dangerous situation." Emma looked up from where she'd been sharing apple slices with Ranger through the fence. "He's not dangerous, Mrs. Henley. He's just lonely." "Child, you don't understand what you're dealing with," said Mrs. Patricia Webb, who'd lived in Millfield for 60 years and considered herself an expert on local affairs. "That dog was retired from police service for a reason. There are things about his past that make him unsuitable for community life." "What things?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possessed. The question caught the women off guard. The truth was, none of them knew the specific details of Ranger's retirement. They'd built their fears on speculation and rumor, but the official records remained sealed. Their certainty was based on assumption rather than evidence. "That's not information appropriate for children," Mrs. Henley replied stiffly. "What matters is that you're putting yourself and others at risk with this foolish behavior." Ranger had retreated to the back of his enclosure when the women arrived. His professional training, recognizing the hostility in their voices and postures. But when Emma spoke, his ears pricked forward, and he took a step toward the fence before stopping himself. "You see?" Mrs. Webb pointed at the movement. "It's responding to her presence, becoming attached. That makes it even more dangerous." "He's not an it," Emma said firmly. "His name is Ranger, and he was a police officer. He protected people." "Was being the operative phrase," Mrs. Henley snapped. "Whatever he was, he's a threat now. And your continued interaction with him is making that threat worse." The confrontation might have escalated, but the approach of Sarah Thompson interrupted the tension. She'd left work early when a customer mentioned seeing her daughter involved in some kind of argument near the old police station. "Emma, what's happening here?" Sarah asked, taking in the scene with growing concern. Mrs. Henley turned her attention to the mother with visible relief. "Mrs. Thompson, we're trying to make your daughter understand the danger she's placing herself in. This animal needs to be removed from our community before something terrible happens." Sarah looked at her daughter, who was standing protectively near the fence despite the adult pressure surrounding her. Emma's face showed determination mixed with frustration, the expression of someone who understood something that the adults around her refused to acknowledge. "Has Ranger ever threatened Emma in any way?" Sarah asked quietly. "The threat is implied in his very presence," Mrs. Webb replied. "These animals are unpredictable. Today he might seem calm, tomorrow he could attack without warning." As the adults continued their debate, none of them noticed that Ranger had moved back to the fence, positioning himself between Emma and the agitated women. His body language spoke of protective instincts rather than aggression, the stance of a guardian rather than a threat. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Carter's patrol car. The sheriff parked and approached the group with the measured pace of someone who'd dealt with community disputes for over 20 years. "Ladies, Mrs. Thompson, Emma," he nodded to each in turn. "I need to speak with all of you about some recent developments." The serious tone in his voice immediately captured their attention. Sheriff Carter was known for his calm demeanor, and the underlying tension in his words suggested something significant had occurred. "We've had another incident, a serious one," he continued. "I can't share all the details, but I need everyone to be aware that we may have a dangerous predator operating in the area around Millfield." The words sent a chill through the group, but Mrs. Henley was quick to seize on what she saw as vindication. "Sheriff, we've been trying to tell you that this dog represents a clear and present danger." Sheriff Carter held up his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, this incident occurred 3 miles outside town and shows evidence of a wild animal, not a domestic one. But I am asking everyone to be extra cautious, especially children." He looked directly at Emma. "Young lady, I know you've been visiting Ranger, and from what I've observed, he seems calm around you. But given the current situation, I'd prefer if you stayed closer to home for the next few days." Emma started to protest, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Emma, the sheriff is trying to keep everyone safe. We'll talk about this at home." As the group began to disperse, Sheriff Carter remained behind for a moment, studying Ranger with professional interest. The dog met his gaze steadily, showing none of the signs of aggression or instability that had been reported by concerned citizens. "You know, boy," the sheriff said quietly, "I think you might be the least dangerous predator in this county right now." The irony in his words would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined, as the real hunt was just beginning. The emergency town meeting, called for that evening, drew an even larger crowd than the previous week. Fueled by news of Dale Morrison's loss and growing fears about the safety of Millfield's residents, Detective Rick Vaughn had spent the afternoon making strategic phone calls, ensuring that the right people would be present to support his plan for dealing with what he termed multiple threats to community safety. Sarah Thompson sat in the same back row as before, but this time Emma remained at home under the watchful eye of their neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. The decision to leave Emma behind had sparked the first real argument between mother and daughter since their move to Millfield, with Emma insisting that Ranger needed her protection, and Sarah determined to keep her child away from what was becoming an increasingly volatile situation. Mayor Reynolds called the meeting to order with visible tension in her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing a crisis that requires immediate action. Sheriff Carter will brief us on the latest developments." Sheriff Carter stood at the front of the room, his usual calm demeanor replaced by the focused intensity of someone dealing with a genuine emergency. "This afternoon, we confirmed that a large predator, likely an exotic cat of some kind, has established territory in our area. The attack on Morrison's bull was not an isolated incident. We've now connected it to a series of attacks across 3 counties." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd as the reality of their situation sank in. This wasn't about neighborhood disputes or competing theories anymore. They were facing a real and immediate danger. "What measures are being taken to protect our families?" asked Tom Martinez, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "State wildlife officials are coordinating with our department to track and safely relocate the animal," Sheriff Carter replied. "In the meantime, I'm implementing a curfew from sunset to sunrise. No one should be outdoors alone after dark." Dr. Walsh stood from her seat in the middle section. "Sheriff, given this new information, I think we need to reconsider our assumptions about other issues we've been discussing. The evidence clearly shows that the recent attacks were not caused by a domestic animal." Her words were directed at the ongoing debate about Ranger, but before Sheriff Carter could respond, Detective Vaughn stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Dr. Walsh raises an excellent point," Vaughn said, his voice carrying across the room. "We do indeed have multiple threats to consider. While the wildlife situation is certainly serious, we cannot ignore the fact that we also have an unstable former police animal living in the heart of our community." Detective Vaughn, Sheriff Carter said carefully. There's no evidence that the K-9 has been involved in any incidents. Sheriff, with all due respect, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, Vaughn replied smoothly. We have a highly trained attack dog that's been isolated and potentially traumatized by abandonment. The presence of another predator in the area could trigger aggressive responses we haven't seen before. The logic was twisted, but it resonated with people who were already frightened and looking for ways to regain control over their situation. If they couldn't immediately solve the problem of a wild predator, at least they could take action against the perceived threat they could see and reach. What are you proposing? Mayor Reynolds asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm offering to safely remove Ranger from our community tonight, Vaughn said. I have contacts at a facility in Nevada that specializes in handling former law enforcement animals. The dog can be relocated where he'll receive proper care while eliminating any additional risk to Millfield. James Foster, the retired Marine who'd spoken up at the previous meeting, stood slowly. Detective, has anyone actually assessed this animal's current temperament? All the reports I've heard suggest he's been calm and responsive to the Thompson girl. Vaughn had been expecting this objection. Mr. Foster, that's exactly what makes the situation so dangerous. The dog has formed an attachment to a child, which creates an unpredictable emotional dynamic. If he perceives any threat to her, his protective instincts could trigger violent behavior. That sounds like speculation rather than professional assessment. Foster replied firmly. It's based on 20 years of experience with these animals, Vaughn countered. The behavioral patterns are well documented in police K-9 units. Emotional attachment to civilians outside the handler relationship creates liability issues that departments can't afford. The debate continued for another 30 minutes, but Vaughn had successfully planted enough doubt to sway public opinion. When Mayor Reynolds called for a vote on authorizing the removal of Ranger, the measure passed by a margin of 37 to 23. As the crowd dispersed, Vaughn felt a surge of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. His contact in Nevada had confirmed that transport arrangements were already in place, and by tomorrow morning, Ranger would be on his way to a new and profitable future. What Vaughn didn't know was that Emma Thompson had not stayed home as her mother believed. The 10-year-old had slipped out of Mrs. Rodriguez's house during the woman's evening phone call and made her way through the darkening streets to the abandoned police station. Her child's logic was simple. If the adults were planning to take Ranger away, then he needed to know he wasn't alone. Emma approached the kennel with practiced stealth, having learned over the weeks how to move quietly enough not to alarm the neighbors. Ranger rose to greet her, his tail wagging with genuine pleasure at her unexpected evening visit. "Hey, boy," she whispered, producing a handful of treats from her jacket pocket. "I heard what they're planning. I won't let them take you away." As she fed him through the fence, Emma noticed something different in Ranger's behavior. His ears kept swiveling toward the forest behind the station, and twice he interrupted his eating to stand at alert attention, his nose testing the air with professional intensity. "What is it, Ranger?" Emma asked, following his gaze toward the dark tree line. The answer came in the form of a sound that chilled her blood, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deeper than any dog's voice, more resonant than any domestic animal could produce. Emma felt her heart rate spike as primitive fear flooded her system. Ranger's response was immediate and dramatic. His entire posture transformed from friendly companion to tactical professional, his body coiling with restrained power as he positioned himself between Emma and the source of the sound. A low whine escaped his throat, not fear, but communication, a warning directed at Emma to move away from the fence. "Ranger, what's out there?" Emma whispered, but the dog was beyond responding to social interaction. Every instinct honed by years of police training was focused on the threat approaching through the darkness. Meanwhile, Detective Vaughn was making his final preparations in the abandoned police station. He'd entered through a window he'd jimmied open earlier in the week, and now he methodically assembled the equipment he'd need for Ranger's capture. The tranquilizer gun was loaded with enough sedative to drop a 150-pound human, which should be sufficient for the German Shepherd. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: sedate the dog, load him into the waiting transport vehicle, and leave behind evidence suggesting that Ranger had become agitated and potentially dangerous. A few strategic scratches on the kennel walls, some planted evidence of attempted escape, and the community would be grateful for his quick action. Vaughn was adjusting the dosage on his tranquilizer when he heard voices outside. Moving to the window, he saw Emma talking to the dog and cursed under his breath. The child's presence complicated everything, but he was too committed to his plan to abort now. He'd simply have to wait for her to leave. But Emma wasn't leaving. As the growls from the forest grew closer and more frequent, she recognized that Ranger was trying to protect her from something genuinely dangerous. The irony was not lost on her even at 10 years old. She understood that the animal everyone feared was the only thing standing between her and real danger. The attack, when it came, was swift and terrifying. A massive shape emerged from the tree line, moving with fluid grace despite its size. The creature was unlike anything Emma had ever seen or imagined, a cat-like predator that stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with pale fur marked by dark rosettes and eyes that reflected the distant streetlights like molten gold. The mountain lion, for that's what it was, had been driven far from its natural territory by drought and human encroachment. For weeks, it had survived on livestock and pets, but now it had discovered something new: a human child, alone and vulnerable, separated from her protectors by nothing more than a chain-link fence. Emma's scream pierced the night air as the massive cat began to stalk toward her, its attention focused entirely on what it perceived as easy prey. But between the predator and the child stood Ranger, and for the first time in months, the trained police dog had a clear mission. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Ranger launched himself at the fence, separating him from Emma and the approaching threat, his powerful body slamming against the chain link with enough force to bend the metal. The sound of his protective fury was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever heard, a battle cry that spoke of professional training and absolute determination. Vaughn watched from the window in shock as his carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos. The presence of an actual predator threatened everything he'd worked to accomplish, but more immediately, it put his own safety at risk. The mountain lion was massive, easily capable of taking down an adult human, and its attention was fixed on the area around the kennel. Emma pressed herself against the fence, separated from Ranger by the barrier that was both protection and prison. "I can't get to you," she sobbed, watching the mountain lion pace just beyond the circle of light from the street lamp. Ranger's response was to renew his assault on the fence, his claws and teeth working at the chain link with desperate efficiency. Years of training had taught him to overcome obstacles, and the imperative to protect Emma overrode every other consideration. The mountain lion paused in its approach, recognizing the sounds of another predator defending territory. But hunger and the scent of easy prey drove it forward, and the big cat began to circle the kennel area, looking for an angle of attack that would bypass the protective barrier of the fence. In the abandoned police station, Vaughn faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could remain hidden and let events unfold naturally, possibly resulting in tragedy but preserving his plans, or he could intervene and risk exposing his true motivations. The decision was made for him when Emma's second scream echoed through the night, followed by the sound of metal giving way as Ranger finally broke through the weakened section of fence he'd been working. The massive German Shepherd emerged from his prison like a force of nature, positioning himself between the mountain lion and the terrified child with the precision of a trained guardian. The confrontation between the two predators was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just Emma's fate, but the truth about who the real heroes and villains were in the quiet town of Millfield. The standoff between Ranger and the mountain lion lasted only seconds, but those moments stretched into eternity for Emma, who watched from behind the protection of the German Shepherd's powerful frame. The two predators assessed each other with the cold calculation of professionals, each recognizing in the other a formidable opponent. The mountain lion struck first, launching itself forward with the fluid power that made it one of nature's most efficient hunters. But Ranger had been trained for exactly this type of encounter, and his response was immediate and devastating. The police dog met the cat's charge head-on, his own considerable weight and momentum transforming the collision into a controlled combat situation. The sounds of the battle carried through the quiet night air of Millfield, bringing residents to their windows and doors. Sheriff Carter, who had been reviewing case files at his office 3 blocks away, immediately recognized the distinctive sounds of a large animal conflict and radioed for backup while rushing toward the abandoned police station. Emma pressed herself against the concrete wall of the building, following Ranger's earlier training, as she instinctively sought the safest position available. Through tears of fear and amazement, she watched as the dog she'd befriended revealed the true extent of his capabilities. This wasn't the gentle companion who'd listened to her read stories. This was a tactical professional engaged in his primary mission. Ranger's training manifested in every movement. He avoided the mountain lion's powerful claws while using his own speed and agility to strike at vulnerable points. The cat was larger and potentially stronger, but Ranger possessed something his opponent lacked: years of experience working with human partners and a deep understanding of protective tactics. From his vantage point in the abandoned police station, Detective Rick Vaughn watched his carefully constructed plans crumble in real time. The presence of an actual predator vindicated everyone who'd questioned his narrative about Ranger's danger to the community. Worse, if the dog successfully defended the child, he would become a hero rather than a liability. Vaughn's phone buzzed with urgent texts from his contact in Nevada, demanding status updates on the pickup schedule. The private security firm's client was expecting delivery within 48 hours, and delays would result in significant financial penalties. Vaughn stared at the tranquilizer gun in his hands, weighing his options as the sounds of combat continued outside. The mountain lion's superior size began to tell as the fight progressed, but Ranger's tactical training kept him in the engagement. He'd learned to work around advantages that opponents might possess, using terrain and positioning to overcome raw power. The German Shepherd led the cat away from Emma, drawing it toward the open area where he'd have more room to maneuver. Sarah Thompson arrived at the scene in Sheriff Carter's patrol car, having been contacted when her daughter was discovered missing. The sight that greeted her would remain burned in her memory forever. Her 10-year-old daughter crouched behind the protection of a police dog who was engaged in mortal combat with a predator that outweighed him by 50 pounds. "Emma," Sarah screamed, starting toward her daughter before Sheriff Carter caught her arm. "Sarah, no," he said firmly. "We let the dog do his job. Any interference now could distract him and get everyone hurt." Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived moments later, having heard the commotion from her nearby clinic. She took one look at the scene and immediately began preparing emergency medical supplies, understanding that regardless of the outcome, there would be injuries requiring immediate attention. The turning point came when the mountain lion, frustrated by Ranger's defensive tactics, made a tactical error. The cat attempted to leap over the dog to reach Emma directly, exposing its vulnerable underside. Ranger's response was instantaneous and precise, his teeth finding their target with the accuracy of countless hours of training. The mountain lion's surprised yowl echoed through the night as it realized its attack had been neutralized. Ranger maintained his grip with professional determination, but his goal was containment rather than elimination. The police dog had been trained to subdue threats, not to destroy them, and that training held even in this life-or-death situation. Wildlife Officer Rebecca Hayes arrived with her specialized equipment just as the mountain lion began to show signs of exhaustion. Working in coordination with Sheriff Carter, she positioned herself for a clean shot with a tranquilizer powerful enough to safely sedate the massive cat. "Clear shot!" she called out, and Sheriff Carter immediately commanded, "Ranger, release!" The German Shepherd's response to the familiar command was instantaneous. Despite the adrenaline and chaos of the situation, his training overrode every other impulse, and he released his hold on the mountain lion while maintaining a protective position between it and Emma. The tranquilizer took effect within minutes, and the mountain lion collapsed into unconsciousness without further resistance. The immediate threat was over, but the implications of what had just occurred were only beginning to sink in for the assembled witnesses. Emma ran to Ranger, who, despite his exhaustion and minor injuries, allowed her to throw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. The dog's tail wagged weakly as he accepted her gratitude, his professional demeanor softening back into the gentle companion she'd come to love. "You saved me," she whispered into his fur. "You saved me, and everyone said you were dangerous." The irony wasn't lost on any of the adults who'd witnessed the confrontation. The animal they'd all feared, the dog they'd wanted removed from their community, had just demonstrated heroism that put their own assumptions to shame. But the night's revelations weren't over. As Sheriff Carter coordinated the removal of the sedated mountain lion, he noticed movement in the abandoned police station. A flashlight beam swept across one of the broken windows, indicating human presence in a building that should have been empty. "Dr. Walsh, stay with Emma and her mother," the sheriff instructed, drawing his service weapon as he approached the building. "Someone's inside." What he found would complete the transformation of the night's narrative. Detective Rick Vaughn sat in the station's main room, surrounded by the evidence of his intended crime. The tranquilizer gun, transport equipment, and falsified documentation told a story that Sheriff Carter recognized immediately. "Detective Vaughn," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who just uncovered a significant breach of trust. "I think you need to explain what you're doing here." Vaughn's mind raced through possible explanations, but the evidence surrounding him made denial impossible. The tranquilizer gun alone would be difficult to explain, and the transport paperwork bore the address of a facility that Sheriff Carter would certainly investigate. "I was attempting to resolve a community safety issue," Vaughn said finally, falling back on the narrative he'd been building for weeks. "By illegally entering an abandoned building with equipment designed to capture a police animal?" Sheriff Carter asked pointedly. "Detective, those transport documents are made out to a private security firm in Nevada. This looks less like community service and more like theft." The accusation hung in the air as the scope of Vaughn's deception became clear. He'd never intended to help Millfield solve its problems. He'd been planning to profit from the community's fears by stealing an animal that belonged to the state. Outside, the assembled residents began to understand the true dynamics of the situation they'd been manipulating. James Foster approached Emma and Ranger, kneeling down to examine the dog's minor injuries with the expertise of someone who'd worked with military animals. "He's got some scratches, but nothing serious," Foster reported to Dr. Walsh. "This dog performed exactly as he was trained to protect and serve." Mrs. Dorothy Henley stood at the edge of the crowd, her earlier certainty replaced by obvious discomfort as she watched Emma gently tend to Ranger's wounds. The sight of the child comforting her protector made her earlier demands for the dog's removal seem not just wrong, but cruel. "I may have been mistaken about the animal's temperament," she admitted quietly to Dr. Walsh. "Perhaps we all were." Sheriff Carter emerged from the police station with Vaughn in custody, and the detective's arrest completed the evening's transformation of assumptions. The man who'd positioned himself as an expert on public safety had been revealed as an opportunist seeking to profit from manufactured fear. As Wildlife Officer Hayes supervised the loading of the tranquilized mountain lion for relocation to appropriate habitat, she paused to observe Ranger's condition. The German Shepherd showed no signs of the aggression or instability that had been attributed to him instead. He displayed the calm professionalism of an officer who'd successfully completed his mission. "Sheriff," Hayes said, "I'd like to recommend that this dog be evaluated for return to active duty. His performance tonight demonstrates exactly the kind of training and temperament that law enforcement agencies value." The suggestion sent a ripple of possibility through the assembled crowd. Rather than being a liability to be removed, Ranger might actually represent an asset that the community had been too frightened to recognize. Emma looked up from where she sat beside Ranger, her young face streaked with tears but shining with pride. "Does that mean he can stay?" she asked. Sheriff Carter exchanged glances with Officer Hayes and Dr. Walsh before responding. "Emma, I think that's exactly what it means. But more than that, I think Ranger has earned the right to be recognized for what he really is, a hero." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse as emergency vehicles arrived to handle the various aspects of the night's events. But the transformation in attitude was unmistakable. Conversations that an hour earlier had focused on fear and removal now centered on gratitude and recognition. Sarah Thompson knelt beside her daughter and the dog who'd saved her life. "Ranger," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. We all do." The German Shepherd's response was a gentle nuzzle against her hand, the gesture of a professional who understood that forgiveness was part of service. As the emergency vehicles departed and Millfield began to return to its normal quiet, Emma remained beside Ranger in what was no longer a prison, but a temporary resting place. The fence that had separated them had been damaged beyond repair during his escape to protect her, symbolically ending the isolation that had defined his recent existence. "Tomorrow, we're going to make sure everyone knows what really happened here tonight," Sarah promised her daughter. "And we're going to make sure Ranger gets the recognition he deserves." Dr. Walsh approached with her medical bag, having completed her examination of the mountain lion. "Emma, I'd like to treat those scratches on Ranger's legs. Would you help me? He seems to trust you more than anyone else." As Emma assisted in caring for her friend's injuries, she reflected on the events that had brought them together. Her child's intuition had recognized something in Ranger, that all the adults had missed the heart of a protector who'd never stopped serving, even in isolation and abandonment. The dawn that broke over Millfield would bring new understanding to a community that had almost lost something precious through fear and misunderstanding. Ranger's heroism had not only saved Emma's life, but had also exposed the deception that had been manipulating their perceptions. Detective Rick Vaughn would face charges for attempted theft and fraud, his career in law enforcement ending in disgrace. The mountain lion would be relocated to appropriate habitat hundreds of miles away, where it could live without threatening human communities. And Ranger would begin a new chapter, no longer the forgotten hero, but the recognized guardian he'd always been. As Emma read the final pages of Where the Red Fern Grows to Ranger in the early morning light, she understood that sometimes the best stories were the ones that happened in real life, where loyalty and courage could overcome fear and prejudice, and where heroes could be found in the most unexpected places. The partnership between a 10-year-old girl and a retired police dog had not only saved lives, but had also taught an entire community about the importance of looking beyond assumptions to find the truth that lies beneath. Dear listeners, we hope that Emma and Ranger's story has touched your hearts and reminded you that heroes often come in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes the very thing we fear most is actually our greatest protection, and it takes the pure heart of a child to see past our prejudices to the truth. This incredible tale of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals shows us that real strength comes not from fear, but from understanding and compassion. Ranger's transformation from outcast to hero mirrors our own capacity to overcome judgment and embrace second chances. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to help us share more inspiring tales like this one. We bring you new stories every day that explore the complexity of human nature and the extraordinary moments that define our lives. Don't forget to leave a comment below, telling us what you thought about Emma's brave friendship with Ranger. Have you ever misjudged someone or something based on fear rather than facts? We'd love to hear your own stories of unexpected heroes and second chances. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to see the good in others, even when the whole world tells you to look away. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we'll see you in our next story.